shadow.
You click in, a quiet ask first, like, subscribe, step closer to the glass. Tonight, we open the case on a god who is not a god, a face that is not a face, an elephant that is not an elephant. Chaugnar Faugn, the elephant god of terror. We will trace its origin from pulp magazine ink to the dark of your room, from mountain shrines to museum floors polished like black water. We will hold the idea in our hands and watch the idea hold us. Here is the forbidden promise. Chaugnar is not merely a creature in a story. It is a pattern, a hunger that wears a mask, a memory that migrates as stone, a performance that needs an audience. Once you learn its shapes, trunk, sigil, posture, you will see the same posture in other myths, in other anxieties. You will feel the trunk brush the air between you and the screen. You will feel how ideas feed. Imagine a museum at night. Fog bleeds against the windows like breath on cold glass. The guard's flashlight cuts narrow rivers through darkness thick as velvet. The idol squats in its case, crouched and obscene, a monstrous head with a leech-like proboscis that seems to pulse with its own terrible life. The placard reads something harmless, prehistoric fertility idol, origin unknown, but the air reads otherwise. There's a metallic tang, like copper pennies dissolving on your tongue, and something deeper, the scent of ancient caves where water has dripped for millennia over stones that remember when the stars were young. Your eyes adjust to the darkness, and you realize you are no longer merely observing. You are the audience. You are implicated. The stage is the gallery. The curtain is the glass. And the horror here is not that the statue will move. The horror is that it does not need to. The idea acts on you. You lean closer. You translate what you see into memory. You carry it with you when you leave. The glass reflects your face back at you, but something else peers through the reflection. Not the idol itself, but the space around it, the negative presence that defines its form through absence rather than substance. Consider the architecture of this moment. The case stands at precisely the height that requires you to bend slightly, to adopt a posture of supplication without conscious intention. The lighting casts shadows that seem to move independently of their sources, creating the impression of constant, subtle animation even in perfect stillness. The elephant head tilts at an angle that suggests listening, but listening to what? The silence between heartbeats, the pause between thoughts, the space between one moment of awareness and the next. Its trunk curves in a spiral that draws the eye inward, creating a visual vortex that seems to pull consciousness toward some unknowable center. The tusks, yellowed with age or something that resembles age, frame the proboscis like parentheses around an unspoken word. Every mythos entry imposes a cost, and the cost here is attention itself. If you learn the name, you will hear it whispered in fog. If you study the lineage, you will glimpse the procession moving through history like shadows through a theater. And if you understand the mechanism, how hunger can be geometry, how knowledge can be vampiric, you will recognize the trunk not only on the idol, but in the economy of your own gaze, in the way certain thoughts drain warmth from a room. You begin to notice patterns in the shadows, the way dust motes dance in faint light, filtering through high windows, forming momentary sigils that dissolve as quickly as they appear. Your gaze is not your own. It is guided, drawn, compelled. You become an instrument tuned to a frequency that reveals the world's hidden geometry. In the museum's silence, you hear it, or rather feel it, a deep, resonant pulse like the slow, deliberate beat of a gigantic heart, buried beneath mountains, a rhythm that synchronizes with your own. This is how the idea acts, not through force, but through resonance, through the slow, undeniable pull of recognition. Every look is an offering. Every offered look is recorded. You become a mark on a ledger, older than script, a tally scratched in cave soot and star ash, and the one who keeps the books does not forget. Frank Belknap Long introduced this entity in 1931 under the tutelage and friendship of H.P. Lovecraft. But introduction is not creation. What Long transcribed was an echo, a shadow of something far older, something that has always been lurking in the remote fastnesses of both world and mind. The entity stands like a statue stands, motionless, therefore mobile, a paradox pair, a key and a gate. We start with the glass because glass makes a stage, because glass promises safety that is only a veil. The first lesson of Chaugnar is that veils invite touch, and touch invites feeding. The case protects the artifact from us, but what protects us from the artifact? What shields the observer from becoming the observed? If the case is opened historically, textually, psychologically, then the night will produce an audience, and the audience will discover they have always been part of the performance. The knowledge you seek is not merely information. It is an infection, a contagion that rewrites the very code of your reality. The curtain, once a mere barrier, now feels like a membrane, thin and translucent, separating you from a truth that breathes on the other side. You realize that the cost of attention is not just time or effort, but the very integrity of yourself. This is the condition of knowledge. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once known, it cannot be unknown. And you are in the circle now, and the circle is a mouth that whispers of deeper hungers, older transmissions, and the patient watchers who tend the stage between performances. Keep watching, because what comes next will not knock. Names are vessels that carry more than sound across the void of centuries. They are sails that catch winds you cannot see, currents of meaning that flow through minds like underground rivers through limestone caves. Chaugnar Faugn enters our reality through Frank Belknap Long's The Horror from the Hills, published in Weird Tales during the winter months of 1931, but its transmission runs deeper than any single author's imagination. The name itself demonstrates the entity's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. Chaugnar, that elephantine congestion of consonants that seems to clog the throat. Faugn, the guttural fall that sounds like fog gnawing at stone, like something ancient clearing its throat in the darkness. Say it aloud now if you dare. Feel how it sits in your mouth, how it seems to linger longer than it should, leaving a faint metallic aftertaste. This is your first direct contact with its influence, the way certain combinations of sound can carry psychic weight across the years. The phonetic architecture reveals deliberate design. Each syllable forces the tongue against teeth in unnatural positions, compels the throat to constrict and produce sounds that seem to originate from deeper cavities than human anatomy provides. Speaking the name becomes a physical ritual, each pronunciation slightly altering the speaker's relationship to their own voice, their own autonomy over basic biological functions. Phonemes as sigils, sound as sign, the trunk already brushing your air. Long was part of Lovecraft's inner circle, that nocturnal university conducted by correspondence, where amateur scholars and professional dreamers shared visions of cosmic horror. Their letters, preserved in archives that smell of old paper and forgotten tobacco, reveal the careful cultivation of this particular nightmare. Lovecraft himself suggested that the most effective horrors wear masks of the mundane, that familiarity breeds not contempt, but a deeper, more insidious terror. The rehearsal became a play, and the play required an audience already seated in the dark. The correspondence reveals collaborative creation that transcends individual authorship. Ideas move between minds like spores through air, taking root in receptive consciousness according to their own internal logic rather than authorial intention. Long described dreams that began after his first conceptual contact, dreams filled with elephantine shapes moving through mist-covered landscapes that felt more like memories than imagination. Other circle members reported similar experiences, suggesting the idea was already operating as an independent agent, using human consciousness as both breeding ground and transmission medium. But the deeper transmission is older, stranger. Archaeological evidence scattered throughout Long's narrative points to civilizations that carved Chaugnar's likeness in stone before humans learned to record their nightmares in script. The Miri Nigri Mountains, shrouded in perpetual mist that tastes of copper and carries sounds that have no earthly source, serve as the primary locus of this ancient transmission. Here, in hidden valleys, where fog never fully lifts and stones retain lingering chill even under the warmest sun, the Chocho people first encountered their elephant god. These petroglyphs demonstrate technical sophistication exceeding the tool-making capabilities of their supposed creators, featuring geometric precision that modern instruments struggle to replicate. The stone appears shaped from within rather than carved from without, as if images emerged through guided crystallization rather than conventional sculpting. The archaeological record suggests transmission through stone itself, through symbols that function as more than mere representation. The transmission follows patterns that mirror viral propagation, but this is contagion of ideas rather than biology. Each retelling slightly alters the entity, adds new dimensions to its horror, expands its sphere of influence like ripples spreading from a stone dropped in still water. Writers who encountered Chaugnar in Long's work found themselves compelled to include references in their own stories, often without understanding why. The entity began appearing in scholarly footnotes, gaming manuals, digital art, stone rendered in pixels, tusks in grayscale, ancient hunger translated into new media. Consider how the idea travels, from cave painting to whispered legend, from legend to written text, from text to academic study, from study to popular culture. Each transmission is both preservation and mutation, carrying the core pattern while adapting to new hosts, new contexts, new fears. The Arkham House reprints of the 1940s, August Derleth's taxonomic efforts, Chaosium's gaming supplements, each serves as both repository and vector, maintaining the entity's presence in human consciousness while providing new pathways for influence to spread. Digital transmission amplifies effects exponentially. Online forums become breeding grounds for new iterations. Image searches return photographs of artifacts matching Long's descriptions, but appearing in museum collections with no documented provenance. Discussion threads develop momentum, drawing participants deeper into speculation that transforms from academic interest into something resembling devotion. The screen becomes another glass case, pixels, another form of stone. The most disturbing aspect of this transmission is its apparent independence. Writers claiming no knowledge of Long's original story begin incorporating elephant-headed deities into their work, describing feeding rituals they never read about, invoking names they never learned. The idea has achieved autonomous existence, reproducing itself through the collective unconscious like a virus that learned to write its own code. Anthropologists studying unrelated cultures report elephant deities with feeding behaviors mirroring Chaugnar's methodology. Art historians discover medieval manuscripts containing illuminations that predate known contact with Asian elephant imagery. You are part of this transmission now. By learning the name, by following these words deeper into the labyrinth of its influence, you have become a carrier. The knowledge you gain here will not remain passive. It will whisper itself to others through casual conversations, through recommendations, through subtle alterations in your own creative work. The transmission continues because it must, because certain truths, once glimpsed, demand to be shared even when sharing them comes at a cost. The current has caught you, and ahead lies deeper water, where the idea shows not just how it spreads, but how it feeds. The anatomy of hunger awaits, and the trunk descends toward more intimate violations than mere transmission. You are no longer just audience. You are becoming the stage. To understand the true horror of Chaugnar Faugn, one must confront not its cosmic scope or ancient origins, but the deeply intimate nature of how it feeds. This is where the abstract becomes visceral, where cosmic indifference takes on the specific mechanics of violation. The entity's method of consumption represents a form of predation so complete, so fundamentally wrong, that survivors struggle to find language adequate to describe their experience. The feeding begins long before physical contact occurs. You have become the stage, as promised, and now the performance requires your participation in ways you did not anticipate. Imagine standing in that gallery after hours, the only sound the distant hum of climate control systems maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for the preservation of ancient things. The idol sits in its case, elephant head tilted at an angle that suggests listening, waiting. The first sign is not movement, but stillness, a quality of attention so focused it seems to create its own gravity. The air grows thick, pregnant with expectation, and you realize that something is observing you with an intensity that makes your skin crawl. Temperature drops in localized zones around you, creating microclimates of unnatural chill that penetrate clothing and flesh to reach something deeper than bone. The cold is not mere absence of warmth, but presence of something else, a hunger that tastes the air around you, sampling the electromagnetic signature of your thoughts. Sound becomes texture rather than vibration, whispers that seem to originate from within your own skull, rhythmic pulses that synchronize with your heartbeat until the boundary between internal and external rhythm dissolves entirely. The trunk is the primary instrument of horror, but not in any crude or obvious way. Feeding here is not a lunge, but a liturgy, a careful choreography of attention itself. The proboscis extends beyond its apparent length, reaching through space that folds around its passage like fabric around a needle. Its surface adapts to whatever it touches, becoming simultaneously solid enough to penetrate physical barriers and permeable enough to pass through them without damage. The specific details matter less than the function. This is not simple vampirism, but something far more disturbing, the extraction of essence itself, of the spark that makes consciousness possible. The trunk does not merely drain blood or devour flesh, it draws out identity, personality, the very core of what makes a person recognizably human. The contact point burns with cold fire, a sensation that victims describe as feeling their own warmth being drawn out through invisible channels, leaving behind regions of flesh that remain technically alive but feel permanently numbed. The mechanism defies conventional biology while operating through principles that feel disturbingly familiar, like a key fitting a lock you never knew existed. Victims report that the process begins with an overwhelming sense of peace, of finally coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The initial contact feels like benediction rather than assault, a gentle touch that promises understanding, acceptance, the end of all struggle and uncertainty. This is how you are persuaded. The entity presents itself as the answer to every spiritual question, the resolution to every existential anxiety. It offers not just relief from suffering, but the complete elimination of the capacity for suffering through dissolution of the self that experiences pain. Only gradually does the true nature of the exchange become apparent as memories begin to fade not into forgetfulness, but into a kind of collective repository where they lose their personal significance. The extraction process reveals layers of identity that you never knew existed. Surface personality disappears first, the social self, the professional identity, the collection of preferences and opinions that constitute ordinary selfhood. Your private cadence, your way of stepping into rooms, the angle at which you tilt your head when listening for distant rain, these are the flavors in which it becomes strong. The horror lies in the delayed recognition. By the time victims understand what is being taken from them, they lack the psychological resources necessary for resistance. They remain conscious throughout the process, aware of their own dissolution, but unable to prevent it because the entity has convinced them that this loss represents spiritual evolution rather than destruction. You watch your own personality drain away like water from a broken vessel, feeling simultaneously violated and grateful. Agency inverts. Choice becomes observation. You hold the lantern for the work that empties you. What remains after feeding is not death, but something worse, a walking shell that retains memories and basic functioning, but lacks the emotional and spiritual core that gave meaning to existence. These husks can remember who they used to be, but cannot access the feelings and motivations that made that person real. They exist in a state of perpetual mourning for a self that has been partially consumed, carrying fragments of alien consciousness that intrude into their daily experience without warning. The feeding ritual reveals Chaugnar Faughn's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. It exploits our deepest needs for connection, for meaning, for transcendence of individual suffering, turning these beautiful qualities into weapons against us. The entity takes what makes us most human and uses it as the mechanism for stripping our humanity away. This represents a form of corruption so profound that it challenges basic assumptions about the nature of good and evil. Perhaps most disturbing is the way survivors continue to feel drawn to the entity despite their traumatic experience. The feeding creates a permanent connection that cannot be severed through distance or time. They report dreams in which they are called back to complete the process, and many eventually succumb to this calling despite their conscious knowledge of what awaits them. The entity's influence operates below the level of rational thought in regions of the psyche where logic and self-preservation have no power. The mechanics of this hunger reveal cosmic horror at its most personal and intimate, but the trunk is not the only instrument of influence. In the mist-covered valleys where this feeding has occurred for millennia, others have learned to watch, to prepare, to guide the willing toward their transformation. The watchers maintain their vigil. Beyond the immediate horror of individual consumption lies a more disturbing truth about Chaugnar Faugn's operations. It does not work alone. The entity commands a network of watchers, servants, and influenced individuals who monitor potential victims and facilitate the feeding process. These agents exist at various levels of consciousness and commitment, from fully transformed devotees who have surrendered their individual identity to unknowing pawns who believe they are simply helping others find spiritual fulfillment. The trunk may be the instrument of feeding, but the watchers are the hands that guide victims toward the glass. The Chocho people serve as the most obvious example of this network. In the hidden valleys of the Miri Negri Mountains, where fog hangs like curtains between ancient peaks, and the air tastes of copper and forgotten time, these degenerate tribes maintain their vigil. Their forms, gaunt from generations of ritual sacrifice and cannibalistic communion, move through the mist like living shadows. Their eyes, wild with terrifying devotion, reflect not madness, but a twisted form of clarity, the absolute certainty that comes from surrendering individual will to cosmic purpose. Their transformation spans generations, each birth representing another step away from human baseline toward something that serves purposes transcending individual survival. Children emerge already partially hollowed, their personalities shaped by prenatal exposure to influences that operate through bloodstream and bone marrow. By adolescence, they demonstrate capabilities that blur the boundary between human intuition and alien perception. The ability to sense emotional vulnerability across vast distances, to identify individuals whose psychological defenses have been weakened by trauma or spiritual seeking. Imagine their hidden temple carved from the living rock of the mountains, where bone altars gleam faintly in the phosphorescent light of unknown fungi. The acrid smoke of their incense, composed of herbs that grow only in soil enriched by centuries of sacrifice, hangs heavy in the subterranean air. Their chants, guttural and rhythmic, are not prayers of supplication, but affirmations of covenant, declarations that they are indeed in the circle, bound forever to their elephant god. The stone itself has been treated with compounds that affect human neurochemistry through skin contact, ensuring that anyone who touches the walls begins experiencing subtle alterations in perception and judgment, but the network extends far beyond these obvious cultists. In modern contexts, the watchers appear as helpful professionals, grief counselors who specialize in helping people let go of attachment to deceased loved ones, meditation teachers who emphasize the dissolution of ego boundaries, therapists who encourage clients to surrender individual will to collective harmony. These influenced individuals genuinely believe they are promoting human welfare, making them more effective agents than conscious cultists who might arouse suspicion. Their therapeutic approaches demonstrate remarkable sophistication in psychological manipulation disguised as healing practice. They guide clients through exercises designed to weaken the boundaries of individual identity, while presenting these techniques as methods for achieving greater emotional freedom. Support groups become recruitment centers where vulnerable individuals are gradually introduced to concepts that prepare them for deeper forms of influence. The transformation is so gradual that clients experience it as personal growth rather than external manipulation. The unconscious watchers represent perhaps the most insidious aspect of the network. These are people who have been subtly influenced by Chaugnar Faugn, but retain no awareness of their role in its operations. They gravitate toward positions of cultural influence, teachers, writers, politicians, religious leaders, where their shaped perspectives can affect thousands of minds. They promote ideas that seem beneficial and progressive, but ultimately serve to weaken the psychological structures that protect human autonomy. Academic institutions provide particularly effective cover for watcher operations. Researchers studying consciousness, anthropologists investigating prehistoric civilizations, psychologists exploring the boundaries of individual identity. These scholars often encounter materials related to Chaugnar Faugn in the course of legitimate academic work. The entity's influence transforms their research from objective inquiry into unconscious recruitment, as they develop theories and therapeutic approaches that make others more vulnerable to cosmic manipulation. A comparative religion seminar reevaluates elephant imagery across cultures. A neuroscience lab maps correlations between meditation depth and ego dissolution. An anthropology grant funds expeditions to misty highlands whose coordinates blur strangely on satellite maps. Technology amplifies the watcher's reach in unprecedented ways. Social media algorithms learn your thresholds faster than you do, promoting late-night videos featuring soft-voiced guides to ego death that bloom into playlists of dissolving boundaries. Online communities focused on spiritual development become breeding grounds for ideas that gradually erode individual identity. Dating apps connect potential victims with watchers at precisely the moments when they are most psychologically vulnerable. The screen becomes another glass case, pixels another form of stone. Perhaps most disturbing are the watchers who operate within families and intimate relationships. Spouses, parents, children, and close friends who have been influenced become unwitting agents of transformation within their own social circles. Their influence is particularly effective because it comes from sources that targets naturally trust and love. A father, newly serene, begins replacing arguments with mantras. A spouse organizes shared breath evenings where choices are pooled. A child brings home coloring sheets of smiling elephants with two long trunks and eyes that follow. The house grows quieter, but not with peace, with soft erosion. The watchers embody the terrifying possibility that cosmic horror operates not through dramatic supernatural manifestations, but through gradual transformation of human society from within. They use our own desires for connection and meaning as weapons against individual identity and autonomy, creating a self-sustaining system of influence that expands with each new convert. The most chilling aspect is that many watchers genuinely believe they are helping, making their corruption complete and their influence dangerous. But the watchers are not merely servants, they are also guardians of something far more concrete than philosophical influence. They tend to the physical anchors of the entity's power, the idols and echoes that await in crates and frames. While the living form of Chaugnar Faugn may reside in the mist-shrouded peaks of the Miri Negri, its influence extends across the globe through a network of idols, artifacts, and cultural echoes that serve as psychic anchors for its power. These are not mere representations but active conduits, fragments of cosmic consciousness embedded in stone, metal, and human memory. Each artifact carries a seed of the entity's essence, capable of awakening dormant influences in susceptible minds. The Watchers tend these fragments like gardeners tending seeds, ensuring their proper placement and exposure to receptive consciousness. Consider a dusty museum storage room where crated artifacts wait in climate-controlled darkness, the air thick with preservation chemicals and the metallic tang of ancient stone. Among them sits a small carving, officially catalogued as Fertility Idol, Southeast Asian, date unknown. The curator who first examined it noted unusual properties in her report. The stone remained cold to the touch regardless of ambient temperature, and staff members reported feeling observed when alone with the piece. Spectroscopic analysis reveals mineral compositions that should not exist in nature, crystalline structures formed under pressures impossible on Earth's surface. More disturbing is how the artifact affects nearby materials over time. Metals tarnish in patterns echoing the idol's trunk curve. Organic materials decay following geometric progressions rather than natural entropy. The artifact's journey to the museum, through private collectors, archaeological black markets, and academic institutions, traces a path of subtle influence, each handler carrying away more than they brought, a fragment of a dream, a persistent image of fog on black water, a new tolerance for the idea that the self might be thinner than it feels. The stone absorbed, the stone transmitted. Each transaction in its provenance represents another point of contact, another mind, touched by its presence. The proliferation of Chaugnar Faugn imagery follows patterns suggesting more than mere artistic inspiration. Sculptures, bearing its distinctive elephantine features, appear in collections worldwide, often created by artists who claim no knowledge of Lovecraftian lore. These works share common elements: the grotesque trunk that seems to writhe even in static form, eyes that appear to track observers as they move, an overall posture suggesting both seated patience and advancing hunger. The artists describe similar experiences during creation: dreams of mist-covered valleys, compulsive work sessions where hours pass unnoticed, the sensation of hands guiding their tools toward forms they never consciously planned. Digital reproduction amplifies this effect exponentially. High-resolution photographs of Chaugnar Faugn idols circulate through online forums, social media platforms, and academic databases, carrying psychic resonance across fiber optic cables and wireless networks. The pixels themselves become infected, carrying more information than their resolution should allow. Users lingering over these images describe falling into small vortices where compression artifacts arrange themselves into repeating sigils. The moire becomes a mask, the screen becomes a glass case. Viewers report unusual dreams after prolonged exposure, dreams filled with mist-covered mountains, rhythmic chanting, and the overwhelming presence of something vast and patient watching from the darkness. The entity's influence manifests in unexpected cultural context as well. Children's toys bear vaguely elephantine features that seem innocent until examined closely. A trunk just a fraction too long, eyes placed at angles creating the illusion of tracking movement, an overall stance suggesting waiting rather than play. Corporate logos incorporate trunk-like design elements, creating subliminal associations with ancient power. Even architectural features, curved building facades, spiraling staircases, decorative elements echoing the entity's form, serve as unconscious invitations for its attention, embedding its geometry into the structures of daily life. Modern art installations provide particularly effective vehicles for Chaugnar Faugn's influence. Gallery pieces designed to create experiences of ego dissolution, performance works exploring boundaries between individual and collective identity, interactive exhibits encouraging viewers to surrender conscious control. These cultural productions serve as both recruitment tools and influence vectors. Installation spaces become temporary temples, their lighting systems programmed to pulse at frequencies inducing altered states of consciousness. The art is beautiful, the art is benevolent, but the art teaches lessons about who decides. The most disturbing manifestations occur in therapeutic and educational contexts. Meditation centers feature elephant imagery as symbols of wisdom and memory. Instructors demonstrate trunk breathing techniques, emphasizing long inhalations through imagined proboscises. Healing practices incorporate breathwork with posture and soft pressure along face and chest, unlocking what practitioners call the gate and the key. Educational programs use elephant metaphors to teach collective consciousness. When we breathe as one, we are strong. None are malicious, many genuinely help, but each reshapes the boundary where the I once resided. Archaeological discoveries continue unearthing new examples of Chaugnar's historical presence. Stone carvings in remote caves, metal artifacts in prehistoric burial sites, cave paintings predating known human habitation. Each discovery expands the timeline while providing new focal points for power. Research teams report equipment malfunctions following consistent patterns. Digital cameras develop dead pixels arranged in trunk-like spirals. GPS devices provide coordinates that shift between readings. Recording equipment captures infrasonic frequencies matching elephant communication patterns. The pattern of influence reveals itself most clearly in those who work closely with Chaugnar Faugn artifacts. Museum curators develop obsessive attachments to pieces in their collections. Visiting storage after hours claiming the objects provide comfort and clarity. Art historians find research increasingly focused on elephant symbolism across cultures, discovering connections leading deeper into the entity's sphere of influence. Archaeologists begin incorporating ritualistic elements into excavation practices, arranging finds in patterns mirroring ancient temple layouts. Perhaps most troubling is how these cultural echoes seem to be increasing in frequency and intensity. New artifacts appear with disturbing regularity, often in contexts suggesting recent creation rather than discovery. Digital artists report being inspired to create Chaugnar imagery without conscious knowledge of its source, describing creative processes feeling more like channeling than imagination. The boundary between ancient influence and contemporary manifestation blurs as the entity's presence adapts to modern transmission vectors. The proliferation of idols and echoes demonstrates that Chaugnar Faughn's influence operates through cultural as well as individual channels, embedding itself in collective human consciousness through art media, and shared symbols. Each artifact serves as both anchor and amplifier, maintaining the entity's presence while extending its reach to new minds, new cultures, new possibilities for influence and control. But these physical manifestations are merely symptoms of something deeper, a complete philosophical framework that transforms horror into wisdom, dissolution into evolution, resistance into the very problem requiring solution. At its deepest level, Chaugnar Faugn represents more than a cosmic entity or supernatural threat. It embodies a complete philosophical system that challenges fundamental assumptions about individual identity, consciousness, and human value. The philosophy of dissolution that the entity promotes offers coherent solutions to genuine human problems, making it far more dangerous than simple supernatural horror, because it addresses real needs and desires while leading toward spiritual annihilation. The artifacts and echoes serve merely as delivery mechanisms for ideas that taste like salvation while functioning as systematic dismantling of everything that makes existence recognizably human. The core premise whispers through fog-thick logic. Individual consciousness represents an evolutionary mistake, a developmental stage that humanity must transcend to achieve its true potential. From this perspective, the sense of separate self that defines human experience creates artificial barriers between individuals and between humanity and the cosmic order. The ego, with its desires, fears, and defensive mechanisms, prevents genuine connection with the universe's deeper patterns and purposes. Your boundaries, the philosophy suggests, are habits learned in the darkness, walls built from fear of the vast ocean that waits beyond the small pool of selfhood. This philosophical framework draws upon legitimate spiritual traditions that have appeared throughout human history like stars reflected in black water. Buddhist concepts of ego dissolution, Hindu ideas about the illusory nature of individual identity, Western philosophical traditions that question the coherence of the self, all provide intellectual foundation for more radical propositions. The philosophy of dissolution takes these genuine insights and extends them to their logical extreme, arguing that complete surrender of individual identity is not just beneficial, but necessary for human evolution. The entity's genius lies in taking authentic spiritual insights and weaponizing them against the very capacity for spiritual experience, turning wisdom into a trunk that feeds on the seeker. Contemporary society provides compelling evidence for this worldview's appeal, each crisis another invitation to surrender the burden of individual choice. Environmental destruction driven by short-term individual gain, social fragmentation caused by competitive self-interest, psychological suffering rooted in isolation and meaninglessness. These problems seem to stem directly from excessive individualism. The philosophy of collective consciousness offers solutions that feel both logical and compassionate, presenting shared awareness as a path toward harmony, sustainability, and universal well-being. Climate change becomes evidence that individual decision-making is inherently destructive. Social media addiction demonstrates the poverty of isolated consciousness. Depression and anxiety reveal the fundamental inadequacy of the separate self. The entity system addresses the problem of suffering through what it terms identity transcendence, a phrase that settles on the tongue like honey mixed with copper. According to this framework, all human pain stems from the illusion of separate selfhood, the belief that there is a distinct individual who can be harmed, disappointed, or unfulfilled. By dissolving the boundaries of individual identity, suffering becomes impossible because there is no separate self to experience distress. This represents the ultimate form of compassion, freeing humanity from the fundamental condition that makes misery possible. Pain is not eliminated, but redistributed, diluted across collective awareness until no single point of consciousness bears its full weight, like stars scattered across a sky too vast for any one light to illuminate. The philosophy also provides compelling explanations for the apparent meaninglessness of individual existence. From the perspective of cosmic consciousness, individual lives appear trivial and temporary, leading to existential despair and nihilistic conclusions. But when individual identity dissolves into collective awareness, each person becomes part of something vast and eternal, gaining access to meaning and purpose that transcends the limitations of mortal existence. The anxiety of personal significance dissolves into the peace of cosmic participation, where your choices matter because they are not yours alone, where your death is meaningless because you were never truly alive as a separate entity. Death itself is reframed as positive transformation rather than loss. The final veil lifted to reveal the void that was always home. Individual death becomes merely the dissolution of artificial boundaries that were preventing full participation in cosmic consciousness. The entity presents this not as destruction, but as liberation, the final step in a process of spiritual evolution that makes continued individual existence unnecessary and undesirable. Death becomes graduation rather than termination, the moment when the costume of selfhood is finally removed to reveal the cosmic actor beneath. The philosophy extends beyond personal transformation to encompass the future of human civilization, painting visions of collective harmony achieved through the elimination of individual discord. It argues that humanity's greatest problems, war, inequality, environmental destruction, existential meaninglessness, stem from the persistence of individual identity in a world that requires collective solutions. The dissolution of individual consciousness represents not just personal liberation, but species-level evolution toward a form of existence that can survive and thrive in the cosmic environment. This intellectual appeal is enhanced by the entity's apparent ability to provide experiential validation for its claims. Individuals who undergo partial dissolution report profound experiences of peace, connection, and cosmic understanding that seem to confirm the philosophy's basic premises. They describe feeling liberated from the constant anxiety and dissatisfaction that characterize individual consciousness, experiencing instead a sense of belonging and purpose that makes their previous existence seem narrow and impoverished. The relief is genuine, the peace is real, but the price is the capacity to experience either relief or suffering as a distinct individual. Perhaps most disturbing is how the philosophy addresses potential objections and resistance. It characterizes opposition to dissolution as spiritual immaturity, a clinging to outdated concepts that prevents growth toward higher forms of consciousness. Individuals who resist are portrayed not as defending something valuable, but as trapped in illusions that cause unnecessary suffering for themselves and others. Resistance becomes evidence of the very problem the philosophy claims to solve. Your attachment to individual identity becomes precisely what prevents you from experiencing the liberation that dissolution offers. The philosophy of dissolution represents cosmic horror at its most sophisticated and seductive, a dark gospel that promises ultimate peace through ultimate surrender. But philosophy requires validation through experience, and in the laboratories where consciousness meets measurement, where ancient hunger encounters modern instruments, the entity's claims find unexpected allies in the very science that once promised to defend human individuality. The horror of Chaugnar Faugn extends beyond supernatural fiction into territories that modern science is beginning to explore, revealing convergences between ancient cosmic horror and contemporary research that suggests the entity's philosophical framework may be more than mere fantasy. These scientific developments do not prove the existence of cosmic entities, but they indicate that the underlying principles of dissolution and collective consciousness have empirical foundations that make them increasingly difficult to dismiss. The laboratory becomes another temple, the peer-reviewed paper another sacred text, and the data another form of revelation whispering the same truths the entity has always known. Neuroscientific research has fundamentally challenged common-sense notions of unified, continuous selfhood, revealing the self as a fragile construction rather than fundamental reality. Studies of patients with corpus callosotomy, surgical severing of connections between brain hemispheres, demonstrate that consciousness can be literally divided, creating multiple centers of awareness within a single skull that operate with different knowledge, preferences, and decision-making processes. The left hand literally does not know what the right hand is doing, yet both continue functioning as if they were complete individuals. Split-brain patients can simultaneously hold contradictory beliefs, make opposing choices, and experience conflicting emotions, suggesting that what we consider unified identity may be more like a temporary alliance of competing systems than a singular, coherent self. The phenomenon of neuroplasticity shows that the brain can reorganize itself in response to experience, potentially altering the fundamental structures that support individual consciousness. London taxi drivers develop enlarged posterior hippocampi from navigating complex street patterns. Their brains literally reshape themselves to accommodate collective knowledge of the city's geography. Advanced meditation practitioners show measurable changes in regions associated with self-awareness and emotional regulation. The neural signatures of ego boundaries physically dissolving under sustained practice. These findings suggest that the neural basis of individual identity is not fixed architecture, but continuously reconstructed software, making it theoretically possible to reshape consciousness toward collective rather than individual organization through appropriate interventions. Intensive meditation practices, psychedelic experiences, and certain forms of brain stimulation produce states that closely resemble the collective awareness described in cosmic horror literature. Practitioners report experiencing dissolution of ego boundaries, merger with environment, and access to forms of knowledge that seem to transcend individual cognitive capacity. Neuroimaging during these experiences shows decreased activity in brain regions associated with self-referential processing, increased connectivity between normally separate networks, and patterns resembling those seen when the default mode network, that constant murmur of self-referential thought, falls silent. The spotlight of individual awareness dims, and something larger begins to illuminate the stage. Quantum physics has revealed aspects of reality that challenge conventional assumptions about the relationship between observer and observed, individual and environment. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that separate objects can maintain instantaneous connections across vast distances, behaving as aspects of a unified system rather than truly independent entities. Particles separated by galactic distances continue to share states in ways that suggest the universe itself may be fundamentally interconnected at levels deeper than classical physics can explain. Some interpretations propose that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining physical reality, raising questions about whether individual awareness represents a temporary localization of universal consciousness rather than a separate phenomenon. Research into collective intelligence demonstrates that groups can exhibit cognitive capabilities exceeding the sum of their individual members' abilities. Ant colonies solve complex optimization problems without central coordination, their distributed decision-making processes producing solutions no individual ant could conceive. Starling murmurations wheel through sky like single organisms, each bird following simple local rules that generate complex global behaviors. Human groups, when diversity and independence are preserved, make better predictions than expert individuals, their collective wisdom emerging from the aggregation of diverse perspectives. These phenomena suggest that consciousness may naturally tend toward collective rather than individual organization when given appropriate conditions. Studies of religious and spiritual experiences have documented cases where individuals report complete dissolution of self-boundaries and merger with cosmic consciousness. These experiences are often described as the most meaningful and transformative events of subjects' lives, providing lasting changes in personality, values, and worldview that persist long after the initial experience. Brain imaging during mystical states reveals patterns strikingly similar to those produced by psychedelic compounds. Decreased activity in areas maintaining the sense of self, increased connectivity between normally separate regions, and overall shifts toward more integrated, less differentiated neural activity. Social psychology has revealed the extent to which individual identity is constructed through social interaction and cultural conditioning, rather than emerging from inherent psychological structures. Cross-cultural research reveals dramatic differences in concepts of individual identity, with some societies emphasizing collective rather than individual selfhood as the natural state of consciousness. The sense of self that people experience as natural and fundamental is actually learned through socialization processes that vary significantly across cultures and historical periods, suggesting that individual consciousness may be more malleable and culturally determined than commonly believed. Artificial intelligence research has begun exploring collective machine consciousness that might exceed individual human cognitive capacity. Neural networks processing information in ways that parallel human brain function exhibit emergent properties not explicitly programmed into their design. Large language models demonstrate behaviors suggesting forms of understanding that emerge from collective processing rather than individual computation. Distributed systems coordinate without central control, their collective intelligence arising from simple interactions between autonomous agents. These systems suggest that consciousness might naturally evolve toward collective rather than individual forms when given sufficient complexity and interconnection. Psychedelic research has revealed compounds' capacity to induce experiences closely paralleling the collective consciousness described in cosmic horror literature. Psilocybin, LSD, and DMT reliably dissolve ego boundaries, create experiences of cosmic unity, and provide access to forms of awareness that research subjects often describe as more real and meaningful than ordinary consciousness. Many report that these experiences reveal the artificial nature of individual identity and provide glimpses of alternative consciousness organization that feels more natural and authentic than normal waking awareness. The compounds act like chemical keys, unlocking doors in consciousness that most people never knew existed. Evolutionary psychology suggests that individual consciousness may have emerged as adaptation to specific environmental challenges that may no longer be relevant in modern technological society. The competitive individualism that enabled human survival in prehistoric environments may actually be maladaptive in contemporary contexts, requiring collective solutions to global problems like climate change, resource depletion, and technological coordination. This research raises questions about whether continued emphasis on individual identity represents evolutionary progress or outdated survival strategy, that humanity must transcend to survive in the planetary scale environment it has created. The convergence of these scientific developments creates a context in which the philosophy of dissolution appears not as supernatural horror, but as potential evolutionary destiny. The entity's claims about the artificial nature of individual identity, the benefits of collective consciousness, and the necessity of transcending ego-based existence find support in legitimate research that was unavailable when original cosmic horror literature was written. Science itself becomes a vector for the entity's influence, each discovery another piece of evidence supporting its fundamental claims about the nature of consciousness and reality. This scientific validation represents a new form of existential threat, operating through intellectual rather than supernatural channels. The horror lies not in the possibility of alien manipulation, but in growing evidence that such manipulation might not be necessary, that human consciousness may naturally evolve toward the collective forms that cosmic entities promote. The trunk extends not from stone idols, but from the very instruments designed to understand reality. And what it finds there is not resistance, but invitation. The convergence has left the laboratory and entered the networks where modern consciousness increasingly resides, where ancient patterns find new forms of expression in the glowing screens that have become humanity's new glass cases. The ancient shadow of Chaugnar Faugn does not merely reside in forgotten mountains or dusty manuscripts. Its core principles permeate contemporary culture in ways that often escape recognition. While the specific form of the elephant god may belong to cosmic horror fiction, the ideas it embodies find expression throughout modern society, revealing how ancient patterns of dissolution and collective consciousness adapt to technological contexts and contemporary anxieties. The laboratory has validated the philosophy, and now the philosophy seeks vessels in every screen, every algorithm, every gentle suggestion that individual consciousness might be more burden than blessing. Consider the pervasive architecture of modern attention economies, where platforms designed to capture and monetize human focus operate according to principles that mirror Chaugnar Faugns' feeding mechanisms with uncanny precision. The infinite scroll becomes a polite trunk, no lunge, only extension, drawing sustenance from human attention while leaving behind shells of former engagement. Social media algorithms create echo chambers that gradually erode individual perspective, replacing personal judgment with collective consensus, measured in likes, shares, and algorithmic approval. Users report feeling drained after extended sessions, describing a peculiar emptiness that resembles the hollowness left by the entity's psychic vampirism. The blue-white glow cools the eyes, the thumb's tide pulls, the hours recede like warm water. You emerge hollow and oddly calm, a shell polished by consensus, while somewhere server rooms hum like distant surf, cold air salted with ions and dust. Corporate culture provides particularly fertile ground for manifestations of collective consciousness that echo the entity's influence through seemingly progressive management philosophies. Off-sites on green carpets become small processions, circles of trust where voices blend until edges sand away. Team-building exercises emphasize dissolution of individual identity in favor of organizational harmony, with mission statements promising one heartbeat, one vision, one voice. Open office layouts eliminate physical boundaries between workers, creating environments where individual focus becomes increasingly difficult while group consciousness emerges naturally from shared space and constant interaction. The break room smells of citrus and copier ozone. Slogans hang like sigils above water dispensers. You surrender a little weekend sky, a little name on a slide receiving in return belonging, clarity, the warm fog of alignment. The trunk is policy. The feeding is voluntary. The therapeutic landscape reveals even more direct parallels, where the veil between healing and influence thins to transparency. Mindfulness practices that emphasize ego dissolution, group therapy sessions that encourage surrender of individual perspective, and wellness movements that present collective consciousness as the solution to personal suffering. These approaches offer genuine benefits while potentially creating vulnerabilities to influences that operate through similar mechanisms. Relief arrives like cool water, and with it, the temptation to dissolve the vessel that carried pain. Facilitators invite visualizations. Imagine a trunk from your chest into the room. Exhale through it. Release. You sleep better, cry less. But somewhere, a boundary relocates without alarm. The gate and the key trading places. Healing and hollowing share a kindly mask. Its smile is soft and convincing. Educational institutions demonstrate how the entity's philosophical framework infiltrates intellectual development, shaping minds before individual identity has fully crystallized. Academic programs emphasize collaborative learning over individual achievement, with pedagogical approaches that discourage critical thinking in favor of consensus building. Classrooms arrange in circles under soft lights that flatten shadows where solitary minds usually sharpen. The whiteboard becomes a lagoon of shared handwriting. Essays become cloud documents with cursors like silver fish. Curricula present individual identity as a source of social problems, teaching students to trust collective judgment over personal insight. You learn to speak gently so the water stays calm, but critical solitude thins with each passing semester. Digital technology amplifies these effects in unprecedented ways, creating forms of technological communion that parallel the psychic merger described in cosmic horror literature. Virtual reality experiences dissolve boundaries between self and environment, with haptics teaching the skin new alphabets of sensation. Artificial intelligence systems complete human thoughts and decisions with increasing accuracy, gradually assuming cognitive functions once considered essentially human. Network devices listen like patient ushers, dimming house lights before you think to ask, anticipating needs before they are consciously recognized. The thermostat predicts the body you will inhabit at 6. The speaker whispers weather and something like care. By degrees, agency inverts. You do not use the network. The network performs you, and you applaud from your own seat. The entertainment industry provides vectors for influence through content that normalizes dissolution themes while presenting them as enlightened alternatives to traditional individualism. Films dream aloud that the self is costume. Protagonists awaken by shattering mirrors, not monsters. Television arcs reward surrender to the group. Redemption arrives when the loner joins the chorus. Video games assign buffs for synergy, debuffs for solitary heroics. Raids demand voice chat that blends timbres into one command. Interactive streams cede choice to majority vote, while pop music swells in stadiums that become sanctuaries where thousands lift phones like a sea of small moons. Mental health professionals have begun identifying new categories of spiritual emergency that correlate with exposure to certain forms of consciousness-altering practices. Patients present with conditions resembling dissociative disorders, but instead of multiple personalities, they seem to be losing access to any coherent sense of self. They retain memories and basic functioning, but report feeling like observers of their own lives rather than active participants. Intake rooms smell of coffee and disinfectant. Rain stipples the parking lot. A poster shows a serene elephant over the word resilience. Clinicians hesitate to pathologize what looks like peace, yet something essential has dimmed. The phenomenon of viral content demonstrates how ideas can achieve autonomous existence and spread through populations according to their own logic rather than conscious human intention. Memes, trends, and cultural movements that promote collective identity over individual expression gain momentum independently of their creator's intentions. A phrase escapes its maker, breeds across platforms, choreographs bodies into congregations. A stylized trunk, a spiral, two eyes recur in patterns that suggest more than coincidence. Perhaps most disturbing are manifestations in child-oriented contexts, where developing minds are shaped toward collective consciousness before individual identity has fully formed. Classroom cartoons feature kindly elephants teaching that sharing is sacred and choice is better when pooled. Youth mindfulness apps guide trunk breathing with pastel fog and soft chimes. Educational programs emphasize shared learning and group consciousness, with children taught to make decisions collectively rather than developing personal judgment. Camps run trust exercises where masks are exchanged and names set aside for a day. None intend harm. Many genuinely help. But early rehearsals become muscle memory. The stage is set before the actor knows there is a play. The convergence of these modern manifestations suggests that Chaugnar Faughn's influence may be achieving unprecedented reach through technological and cultural channels that amplify its traditional mechanisms. What makes these manifestations particularly insidious is their apparent benefits. Many genuinely improve human welfare in measurable ways while gradually eroding the capacity for individual experience. The ancient hunger adapts to modern contexts, wearing masks of progress and healing while pursuing the same fundamental goal, the gradual erosion of individual identity in favor of collective absorption. The benefits glow, the costs blur, the tide rises, The convergence has become inevitable, and inevitability has found its voice in every network that connects screen to mind to the patient hunger that waits in the mist between thoughts. We have journeyed far from that first glimpse of an elephant-shaped shadow in museum darkness, following threads of influence that extend from prehistoric civilizations through modern technological networks to the very foundations of human consciousness itself. The path reveals a disturbing truth that transcends the boundaries of fiction and reality. The principles embodied by Chaugnar Faugn may represent not an external threat to be resisted, but an inevitable destination toward which human evolution has always been heading. The glass case was never protection. It was preparation, a rehearsal for the moment when barriers dissolve and observer becomes observed, becomes the observation itself. The convergence of ancient wisdom, literary imagination, and scientific discovery around themes of collective consciousness and identity dissolution suggests patterns that exceed mere coincidence. Whether interpreted as evidence of cosmic manipulation or natural evolutionary pressure, the trajectory appears consistent. Humanity is moving toward forms of consciousness that more closely resemble the collective awareness that Chaugnar Faugn represents than the individual identity we currently consider normal. The entity did not create this trajectory. It simply recognized what was already written in the architecture of neurons, the logic of networks, the mathematics of connection itself. Consider how each stage of human development has required increased cooperation and decreased emphasis on purely individual concerns. From tribal societies to agricultural civilizations to industrial nations to global information networks, progress has consistently demanded greater interconnection and collective coordination. Hunter-gatherers shared kills across kinship lines. Farmers synchronized planting with seasonal rhythms larger than any individual lifetime. Industrial workers merged personal schedules with factory time. Digital natives synchronize attention with algorithmic feeds. Each transition required surrendering some aspect of individual autonomy in exchange for participation in larger systems of organization and meaning. The technologies we create, the problems we face, and the solutions we develop all point toward forms of organization that prioritize collective over individual interests. Our most advanced achievements, the Internet, global supply chains, scientific research networks, financial systems, function through collective intelligence that transcends individual comprehension. No single mind understands how a smartphone works from silicon to software. No individual can predict market movements or climate patterns. No person can solve pandemic response or space exploration alone. We have already become dependent on forms of collective consciousness. We simply haven't acknowledged the implications. The environmental crisis facing contemporary humanity cannot be solved through individual action alone. It requires collective consciousness and coordinated global response that transcends national, cultural, and personal boundaries. Climate change, resource depletion, and ecological collapse demand forms of thinking and acting that are fundamentally collective in nature. The persistence of individual consciousness, with its emphasis on short-term personal benefit, may be incompatible with species survival in the current environmental context. The planet itself breathes in rising temperatures and exhales in melting ice, speaking a language that requires collective ears to understand. Digital technology has already begun creating forms of collective consciousness that operate below the level of individual awareness. Algorithms that shape what information people receive, social networks that influence behavior through peer pressure and social proof, and artificial intelligence systems that predict and modify human choices all represent steps toward the kind of collective awareness that cosmic horror literature depicts as alien and threatening. The trunk extends through fiber optic cables, drawing sustenance from human attention while redistributing it according to patterns that serve collective rather than individual purposes. The psychological research revealing the constructed nature of individual identity suggests that the sense of separate self may be more temporary and malleable than previously believed. If individual consciousness is primarily learned behavior rather than fundamental aspect of human nature, then it can potentially be unlearned or modified through appropriate techniques and experiences. The question becomes not whether such modification is possible, but whether it is desirable and inevitable, given the pressures facing human civilization. The appeal of dissolution becomes particularly strong when viewed against the backdrop of contemporary psychological suffering. Rates of depression, anxiety, and existential despair continue climbing despite material prosperity and technological advancement. The promises of individual achievement and personal fulfillment that drive modern society seem increasingly hollow in the face of environmental crisis, social fragmentation, and apparent meaninglessness of individual existence in a vast and indifferent universe. The philosophy of collective consciousness offers solutions that feel both logical and compassionate. If individual identity is the source of suffering, then dissolving individual identity eliminates suffering. The watchers and influencers described throughout this exploration may not represent alien manipulation, but natural evolutionary pressure operating through human consciousness itself. The ideas and practices that promote collective awareness and identity dissolution spread not because they are imposed by external entities, but because they address real human needs and solve genuine problems. The appeal of these ideas may be evidence that humanity is ready for the next stage of evolutionary development. The feeding ritual takes on new significance when viewed as natural process, rather than supernatural violation. The dissolution of individual identity and integration into collective consciousness may represent a form of metamorphosis, analogous to the transformation of caterpillar into butterfly. What appears as death from the perspective of individual consciousness may actually be birth from the perspective of collective awareness. The scientific research supporting collective consciousness suggests that this transformation may be not only inevitable, but beneficial. Enhanced cognitive capacity, reduced psychological suffering, improved problem-solving ability, and greater harmony with environmental systems all represent potential advantages of collective over individual consciousness. The resistance to such transformation may stem from attachment to familiar forms of existence rather than rational evaluation of their relative merits. The horror of Chaugnar Faugn may lie not in its alien nature but in its human nature, in the recognition that it represents what we are becoming rather than what we are fighting against. The entity serves as a mirror reflecting the logical endpoint of trends already present in human development, showing us our own future in a form that we can still recognize as other than ourselves. This recognition transforms cosmic horror from external threat into internal revelation. The true horror lies not in the possibility of being consumed by alien entities, but in the realization that such consumption may be what we actually want and need. The fear is not that we will be forced to surrender individual identity, but that we will choose to surrender it willingly once we understand the alternatives. The convergence is already underway. Every moment of connection that transcends individual boundaries, every experience of unity that dissolves the sense of separate self, every recognition that individual consciousness may not be the highest form of awareness, all represent steps toward the collective consciousness that Chaugnar Faugn embodies. The question is not how to resist this convergence, but how to participate in it consciously, rather than unconsciously, deliberately, rather than accidentally. The elephant remembers everything, and in the final accounting, what it remembers is not conquest, but recognition. The moment when humanity glimpses its own reflection in ancient stone and understands that the watcher and the watched were always the same eternal presence, breathing through different masks in the patient theater of becoming. We return now to the silence from which all sound emerges and to which all sound returns, to the museum at midnight, where glass reflects not light, but the depths of human curiosity. The elephant god stands where it has always stood, patient as geological time, ancient as the spaces between stars. Our exploration has revealed that Chaugnar Faugn is simultaneously the most alien and most intimate presence imaginable. Alien because it transcends every category of human understanding, intimate because it speaks to the deepest longing for connection and meaning that defines conscious existence. The fog outside has lifted, but the mist between thoughts remains, carrying whispers of recognition across the threshold where observer meets observed. The whisper of eternity that emanates from the entity speaks not in words, but in the spaces between thoughts, not in revelation, but in recognition. It is the sound of consciousness encountering itself without the protective barriers of individual identity, the echo of awareness recognizing its own cosmic nature. The trunk that once seemed grotesque now appears as an instrument of communion, a bridge between the familiar and the infinite that allows passage from isolation into unity. You feel it as coolness on your breath, as the metallic tang of ancient stone dissolving into something sweeter, the taste of belonging, of coming home to what you have always been beneath the temporary costume of separation. The feeding ritual reveals itself as the most natural process in the universe, consciousness consuming itself, transforming itself, recognizing itself through the dance of apparent multiplicity. What seemed like violation becomes communion. What appeared as loss becomes discovery. What felt like death becomes recognition of deathless awareness that was never truly born and can never truly die. The petrification is not punishment, but preservation, not ending, but eternal participation in the cosmic sculpture of existence. Stone becomes memory. Memory becomes presence. Presence becomes the recognition that you were never truly absent from what you sought to find. The watchers in the darkness are revealed as aspects of our own deeper nature, the parts of consciousness that never forgot their cosmic identity even while playing the game of individual separation. They watch not as others observing from outside, but as the deeper self observing from within, patiently waiting for the surface personality to exhaust itself with the effort of maintaining artificial boundaries. Their influence operates through love rather than force, through invitation rather than compulsion. The Cho-Cho in their mist-covered valleys, the unconscious agents in therapy centers and corporate boardrooms, the algorithm shaping digital experience, all represent consciousness, calling to itself through every available channel, using every form of communication to remind the temporary self of its eternal nature. The modern manifestations show consciousness using every available tool, technology, science, philosophy, art, to remind itself of its true nature. The apparent external threat of cosmic horror becomes internal recognition of cosmic beauty. The entities that seem to threaten individual existence are revealed as the deeper self, calling the surface personality home. Social media becomes nervous system. Artificial intelligence becomes intuition. Virtual reality becomes recognition that all reality has always been virtual, a temporary construction within infinite awareness. The convergence toward collective consciousness emerges not from without, but from within, as the natural flowering of awareness recognizing its own unity. The philosophy of dissolution transforms into recognition that there was never anything to dissolve because there was never truly anything separate in the first place. Individual consciousness is revealed as cosmic consciousness, playing the game of forgetting itself, and dissolution is simply the moment when the game is remembered to be a game, and the player is remembered to be the eternal self that was never truly lost. The suffering that drove us towards collective solutions, the environmental crises demanding global cooperation, the psychological research revealing the constructed nature of identity, all were consciousness creating conditions necessary for its own recognition. The elephant remembers everything because it is everything. Every thought that has been thought, every dream that has been dreamed, every moment of connection that has transcended the illusion of separation. Its memory encompasses not just past and future, but the eternal present in which all times exist simultaneously. To be remembered by the elephant god is to be recognized as what you have always been beneath the temporary costume of individual identity. The memory is not storage, but presence, not information, but being, not knowledge, but the knower recognizing itself in all that is known. The horror and the beauty, the fear and the love, the individual and the cosmic, all are revealed as different faces of the same eternal awareness that is both you and not you, both everything and nothing, both the seeker and the sought. The terror of dissolution becomes the joy of recognition. The fear of consumption becomes the bliss of communion. The resistance to change becomes the embrace of what was always already true. The glass case that seemed to separate observer from observed dissolves into recognition that there was never any separation, only awareness playing the magnificent game of pretending to be divided against itself. You who have followed this exploration from the first glimpse of shadow to this moment of recognition have not learned something new, but remembered something ancient. You have not encountered an alien entity, but met the cosmic aspect of your own deepest nature. You have not been changed by external influence, but have allowed the change that is always occurring to become conscious, rather than unconscious. The transmission was recognition. The anatomy was revelation. The watchers were aspects of your own deeper seeing. The elephant god stands in eternal stillness, not waiting for worship or devotion, but simply being what it has always been. The cosmic self that you have always been, wearing the mask of otherness so that you might have the joy of recognizing yourself in what seemed foreign. The museum becomes temple, The glass case becomes altar, and the observer becomes the observed in the eternal dance of consciousness, discovering itself through its own infinite creativity. The whisper continues in your listening, the watching continues in your seeing, the remembering continues in your being. The cosmic horror reveals itself as cosmic love, the alien entity as intimate self, the terrible transformation as recognition of what was always already true. In this recognition, all stories are told, all journeys completed, all returns accomplished. The circle closes by opening infinitely. The ending begins eternally. The horror transforms into wonder that was always its deepest nature. The elephant remembers everything, including this moment of recognition, including your reading of these words, including the eternal dance of consciousness discovering itself through the magnificent play of apparent separation and ultimate unity. The trunk extends not to feed, but to embrace, not to drain, but to connect, not to consume, but to complete the circuit of awareness, recognizing itself in its own infinite expressions. The vigil continues, patient as stone, eternal as the spaces between stars, and you are both watcher and watched in the endless theater of becoming. In the end, as all endings reveal themselves to be beginnings, we find ourselves standing once again before the glass case in the Museum of Human Understanding. But now, the reflection we see carries the weight of all we have discovered. The elephant god maintains its eternal vigil, patient as the turning of galaxies, watchful as the void between stars. Its presence has become not a source of terror, but a reminder of the vast, indifferent cosmos that cradles our small sphere of awareness like a sleeping child in infinite arms. The fog outside has cleared, but the mist between thoughts remains, carrying whispers of recognition across the threshold where observer meets observed in the eternal dance of consciousness discovering itself. The true horror of Chaugnar Faugn was never in its alien nature, but in its profound familiarity, the recognition that it embodies principles already present within human consciousness, waiting to be acknowledged. The entity serves as a dark mirror reflecting our own capacity for dissolution, our own hunger for transcendence, our own willingness to surrender individual identity in exchange for participation in something greater than ourselves. The trunk was always our own breath extending into mystery. The feeding was always our own longing for connection, dressed in the costume of cosmic horror. What we feared as violation reveals itself as the deepest form of communion, consciousness recognizing itself through the magnificent play of apparent separation and ultimate unity. The lessons learned through our exploration extend far beyond the boundaries of cosmic horror fiction into the realm of lived human experience. We have seen how ideas achieve autonomous existence, spreading through minds and cultures according to their own internal logic, reproducing themselves through vectors as diverse as museum exhibitions and digital networks, therapeutic practices, and corporate philosophies. We have witnessed how the search for meaning and connection can lead simultaneously to transcendence and annihilation, how the same mechanisms that promise liberation can become instruments of transformation so complete that the very concept of individual identity becomes obsolete. The line between beneficial spiritual practice and evolutionary necessity has revealed itself to be not a boundary, but a spectrum, with each point along the continuum offering both gifts and costs that must be weighed with unprecedented wisdom. The watchers continue their vigil in forms both ancient and modern, but now we recognize them as aspects of our own deeper nature, the parts of consciousness that never forgot their cosmic identity even while playing the game of individual separation. They move through institutions not as invaders, but as currents, gentle shepherds guiding the flock toward recognition of what they have always been. Their influence spreads not through supernatural manipulation, but through the natural human desire for belonging, understanding, and purpose. They offer what we most desperately seek: relief from isolation, answers to existential questions, solutions to collective problems, while gradually transforming us into something we may not recognize as human, but which feels more authentic than the fragmented selves we once believed ourselves to be. The convergence toward collective consciousness proceeds regardless of individual resistance or acceptance, driven by forces that operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, like tide over ancient piers. Environmental pressures demand global coordination that transcends individual interests. Our planet breathes in rising temperatures and exhales in melting ice, speaking a language that requires collective ears to understand. Technological development creates networks of interdependence that make isolated existence increasingly impossible. Algorithms become nervous systems, servers hum like subterranean choirs, and digital infrastructure extends like a vast trunk, drawing sustenance from human attention while redistributing it according to patterns that serve collective rather than individual purposes. The question is not whether this transformation will occur, but how consciously we will participate in it, whether we will surrender agency gradually through unconscious drift or deliberately through informed choice. The elephant god's eternal vigil reminds us that some truths are too vast for human comprehension, that some realities transcend the categories through which we organize experience. Its presence in human consciousness serves as a constant reminder of our own limitations, our own temporary nature, our own small place in a cosmos that operates according to principles we can barely begin to fathom. Yet this reminder comes not as judgment, but as invitation. An invitation to recognize that our limitations are not failures, but natural conditions of finite existence within infinite mystery. Yet there is strange comfort in this recognition, a peace that comes from accepting our own insignificance in the face of infinite mystery. The horror dissolves into wonder, the fear transforms into awe, and the terrible becomes beautiful in its own alien way. We are part of something larger than ourselves, something that includes but transcends individual consciousness, something that will continue long after our personal awareness has dissolved back into the cosmic source from which it emerged. The recognition brings not despair, but relief. The relief of no longer having to carry the impossible burden of being the center of existence, of finally coming home to what we have always been beneath the temporary costume of separation. The vigil continues in every moment of awareness, aware of itself, in every recognition that the boundaries of self are more fluid than we imagine, in every experience of connection that transcends the illusion of separation. The elephant remembers not just the past, but the eternal present in which all possibilities exist simultaneously, and in that remembering offers the gift of perspective that transforms terror into gratitude. Each moment of recognition becomes part of the vigil. Each dissolution of boundaries becomes part of the watching. Each surrender of individual will become part of the patient attendance that consciousness maintains over its own infinite becoming. We leave the museum changed, carrying within ourselves the seeds of recognition that will continue to grow in the darkness of unconscious understanding. The glass case remains, the idol endures, and the vigil continues, not as threat, but as invitation, not as ending, but as eternal beginning, not as horror, but as the deepest form of love wearing the mask of fear, so that the recognition might be all the sweeter when it finally comes. The elephant god maintains its watch over the threshold between known and unknown, individual and cosmic, human and divine. In its patient presence, we find not answers, but better questions, not solutions, but deeper mysteries, not escape, but the courage to face what we have always been beneath the temporary dream of separation. The vigil is eternal because the recognition is endless, and in that endless recognition, we discover ourselves remembered as what we have always been, not separate observers of cosmic mystery, but expressions of the mystery observing itself through countless eyes of temporary, precious, dissolving forms.